even though I hated him so much, I also just couldn't not love him. You can f off and die. The Greenbone Saga might just be my favorite fantasy trilogy to date. I started my adult fantasy journey with trilogies like the Shades of Magic series and the Poppy War series, but I think the Greenbone Saga has taken the cake. And I think that's because of how consistent it is. There are just so few low points in this series that I can actually think of. So if you aren't familiar with Jade City, Jade War, and Jade Legacy, this is an urban gangster fantasy set in an Asian-inspired metropolis. And my hand is now killing me, so I'm putting these books down. It revolves around a family called the Calls, primarily 3 siblings and their younger adopted cousin. And the Call family are the leaders of the No Peak clan, which is one of 2 of the largest clans on this island called Kaikon. The rival clan that they are at war with is called the Mountain, and throughout the story we get to see how our main characters struggle with the expectations and the responsibilities that are put on them because of this war by their families and the clan. In this world there is a magical gem called Jade, and Jade wearers are called Greenbones, and they basically have sort of superhuman abilities. The Jade enhances their natural abilities. It is central to this trilogy, everyone wants it, and everyone wants control over it. I read Jade City last year in October, and the reason that I had such a big gap was that A, emotional damage, and B, I really wanted to be able to binge it. I really wanted to be able to fully immerse myself in the story. And last week I was able to do that, and I read Jade War and Jade Legacy in a week. I think it was around 1,300 pages, which is incredible for me, especially with high fantasy. I tend to take a month to get through a book of that size. I have so much to talk about. There was so much that I missed in my 2-minute long TikTok review, so I thought I had to bring it here. So let's just get into it. There will be no spoilers apart from a section at the end where I'll talk about my favorite moments from the series, but I'll give you plenty of warning when that's coming. First off, these characters are phenomenal. There is a massive emphasis on complex characterization and human conflict. I want to go through them individually, but they are without a doubt the best part of this book, and I think the primary reason for that is that Fondaline never tells you how to feel about them. I was so intrigued by her ability to show rather than tell, and I know it's such a basic writing point, but I feel like so many authors struggle with it. She never has to tell you that a character is witty or strong or arrogant because she shows it through their actions, through the way they speak, through how other characters react to them. I especially loved how characters never fit into any certain archetype or box because it really forced me to draw my own conclusions about the characters. They're not heroes, they're real people who do really horrible things. And because we get those different points of view, we get those different reactions and thought processes, it's really up to the reader to decide where they stand on a certain character. More than ever, I felt that I had to examine my own moral compass when I was reflecting on characters' actions. It honestly made me feel like I had never experienced a properly morally grey story before, apart from maybe Game of Thrones, because I've read books about murderers and anti-heroes, and while they are considered morally grey, I feel like there's still a sense of right and wrong that the author pushes on you. There's always that justification. Like, yes, this character is doing something bad, but hey, this character is doing something way worse. And in this trilogy, that is really non-existent. There were so many times when I was questioning who the villains were in this series. Probably the closest I've ever read to something like that is Victor Vale and Eli Ever from Vicious, but I loved the grittiness of this book. Fondaline did not hold back. The character that I found most interesting and the one that probably pushed those moral boundaries to the extent is Hilo. At the start of Jade City, I sort of recognized him as that stereotypical bad boy with a terrible temper, but I was so pleasantly surprised that he was so much more than that, and even though I hated him so much, I also just couldn't not love him. To me, he was probably the most well-written character just because of the work that Fondaline puts in at the beginning to foreshadow his breaking points. I am someone who does not forgive or forget when a character says something or thinks something or does something that I find to be really hurtful or horrible. And the reason I say that is because there is this one line in Jade City that Hilo just thinks offhandedly when he's with his girlfriend Wen. And that one line had the power to change my entire perception of Hilo, and it stuck with me because I thought it had gone against his characterization. So it really threw me off, but then as I kept reading, I realized that that was so important. That line exposes this piece of his personality that makes Hilo's actions in the rest of the series make so much sense, because that's who he is. It hasn't come from nowhere. It's been perfectly built up, subtly, but really well. It was the subtle changes in the way characters think that made me appreciate these books so much. Wen was my favorite character, and in a very close second, I was always rooting for them in every single scene they were in, and definitely the 2 that I tear up the most thinking about because their journeys were so emotional. Shay also probably had some of the best development over the course of the books. She's definitely the most frustrating character, but I think I loved her just as strongly as I hated her. She makes plenty of mistakes, but I think I enjoyed Jade War the most because there was a lot of focus on Shay. She was probably the character that surprised me the most and gave the best plot twists. And on that note, let's talk about the plot. It spans decades and it revolves heavily around the politics in this world, so if politics is not your thing in fantasy books, I wouldn't recommend this. The 2 second books rely more on corporate strategy and business maneuvering rather than physical force, but I don't think it ever loses that labor stable of the family saga. I think that's always the most important thing, those relationships that make up the core family. There's such a great range of dynamics as well. You've got like siblings and cousins and sons, daughters, then you have parents, you have wives and husbands, boyfriends and boyfriends. I have to mention that Fonda Lee is a martial artist. She has a black belt herself, which is not only the coolest thing ever, but you can also see how it's impacted her writing in the best way possible, because the duel scenes, I was holding my breath with anticipation. Those were so good. And she does not hold back from these characters getting bruised and battered. One of my favorite things about this book is the way that Fonda Lee constructs her plot. She does not leave loose ends. She does not forget about anything. I would completely forget about plot points or characters that had just gone off, and then suddenly, bang, they're back. And it's so satisfying because you know that these characters are always going to have to deal with the consequences of their actions. Nothing is ever going to be forgotten. There was always that vicious cycle of revenge and crossing plot lines that made sure everything was always relevant to the central story, and I really appreciated that. I also want to quickly touch on Fonda Lee's writing style because she described it herself. I'll try and find the article. She described her writing as it doesn't bring attention to itself, which I think is a perfect description. I was never taken out of this world because of the writing. It was so relentlessly consistent throughout the whole trilogy, and I'd never seen that before. It's very blunt, it's fast-paced, it doesn't give you a lot of time to focus on one character or one certain event for a long time before skipping maybe years into the future. You're constantly jumping around in a way that still makes sense. It's still satisfying. It's not like you forget about a certain main character. They all are given pretty ample time. And I also think that her writing style is really well suited to the political fantasy story. I think that it really helped me be able to absorb the hugeness of the world. I did think though that sometimes it took away from our ability to really get inside a character's head and really feel things with them for more than a few pages. This was especially evident in Jade Legacy. I felt like everything and everyone was spread just a little bit too thin. I really wanted more time with certain characters. And one of the other reasons that that dropped from a 5-star to a 4.5 star for me was because the plot got a little bit predictable and the stakes were a little bit lower. I was still like for most of the book, but I felt like things had gone down half a notch because I had a pretty good idea who was going to make it to the end and who wasn't. In every book, this world gets bigger and bigger, and we are gradually exposed to different parts of the world outside of the island. There's not that much in the actual setting that stands out from our own world, but I really liked how Jade was the center of everything, and there was a significant amount of consideration that went into creating this magic system. I loved how it caused international conflict and how not everyone had the ability to use Jade, but they were finding ways around it. It was like Fonda Lee built the system and then poked holes in it and then built her story around those holes. Jade is such an integral part of the clans. It's treated with such importance by every single character. But it's strange because honestly, sometimes it doesn't feel like a fantasy element. I'm not too sure how to explain this properly. I feel like maybe it's because there's no info dumps on this magic system. You're gradually exposed to it. You kind of add the information to your body of knowledge. Or maybe it's because the powers that Jade gives you are quite subtle. You know, they're not these big like flames or like ice. They're quite easy to understand as opposed to a magic system that requires more training and explanation and exertion from the characters. So yeah, it's a weird one because these books feel more gangstery and political than they do fantasy, but those elements wouldn't exist without the fantasy element. Now I'm going to start talking about my favorite moments from the series, so there will be spoilers in this section, so you can skip through to the outro if you haven't finished the series yet. First up, the Greenbone action movie sequel being called Too Black, Too Green. I had to put the book down. Amazing. The showdown between Shay and 8 Marder was so good. And I'd say the same about every interaction they had after that. Every time 8 Marder was on the screen, what? See? It was so cinematic. Like, what? There's no screen. It was a book. Wow. Maybe I really want this adapted. Every time 8 Marder's name was on the page, I was like, I'm strapped in. She was so interesting. I actually wish that there was more of her, not gonna lie. I really loved the Make family, especially Tar's little redemption journey. I was very surprised at how emotional I actually got in his chapters because we really hadn't seen that much of him or got to know him at all. His initial exile in Jade War was such a difficult scene to read because it was just so heartbreaking, but I was so glad that she revisited his character and brought his journey to an end. One of my absolute favorite lines and moments was when Woon's wife or ex-wife at the time in Jade Legacy said, "Call Shaylinson, we're the man of no peak, you can fuck off and die." Fantastic. Another amazing moment was when Andon was standing up to John Remy when he wants him to do something disgusting in exchange for his loyalty to the core family. I was so happy for him. I was cheering and clapping. I was so happy he'd found his spine. My wand mic is falling apart, so it's a good thing it's the end of the video. Overall, such an epic trilogy. I had such an unforgettable experience reading this. Also, I want to say a massive thank you to all the new subscribers who might have found me through my last video. I did not expect it to do as well as it did, but I was really, really proud of it, and I was so happy that a lot of you really enjoyed it. I'm working on a few new video essays, but they do take their time to create, so I hope you stick around, and I look forward to sharing them with you in the future. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.